Welcome back to the Avoidant Effect, where we break down avoidant attachment, emotional patterns, and the psychology behind what happens when someone finally realizes what they lost. The avoidant never feared your love as much as they feared being truly seen by you. You saw through the distance, the silence, and the excuses without begging them to change. And when you finally stopped chasing and chose your own peace, something inside them began to shift. Because losing access to someone who understood them can force an avoidant to face everything they spent years running from. The avoidant was never truly afraid of your love. What unsettled them was the possibility that you could see through them. Read that again, because this is where many people misunderstand the entire dynamic. They didn't necessarily distance themselves because you cared too much. They pulled back because your presence was beginning to expose parts of them they had spent years keeping hidden. Avoidant people often feel comfortable when the other person keeps pursuing. Your messages, explanations, reassurance, and attempts to reconnect can actually reinforce the story they already carry about relationships. Closeness feels like pressure. Emotional needs feel overwhelming. Distance feels like control. As long as you keep reaching for them, the pattern remains predictable. But you stopped. Not to manipulate them, not to make them jealous, not to force them to come running back. You simply reached a point where you could finally see the situation clearly. You noticed who was carrying the relationship. You recognized the repeated cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. And instead of trying to punish them, you decided to stop abandoning yourself just to keep the connection alive. That decision can completely disrupt an avoidant's internal world. Their identity is often built around being independent, self-sufficient, and perfectly capable of standing alone. When you were constantly pursuing them, that identity felt secure. You needed them. They could remain distant. They could tell themselves they were the one who didn't need anyone. But when you genuinely stopped reaching, that story suddenly had a missing piece. You were no longer playing the role they expected you to play. The second major shift happens when emotional deactivation begins losing its effectiveness. Avoidant attachment doesn't mean a person feels nothing. Research on attachment avoidance has found that people can minimize their conscious awareness of distress while their bodies still respond to attachment-related stress. Their calm exterior can therefore be less about genuine emotional peace and more about controlling what they allow themselves to feel. When you were pursuing them, there was always something for those defenses to push against. Your messages, your emotions, your desire for closeness gave them a reason to maintain the wall. Then you became quiet. Now the wall has nothing outside itself to fight. Instead, the emotions they were avoiding can begin turning inward. Memories become louder. Longing becomes harder to dismiss. Moments they once minimized start taking on new meaning. They may finally begin feeling the absence they couldn't fully process while you were still standing in front of them. Then comes another uncomfortable shift. The story they created about you begins to fall apart. Maybe they convinced themselves you were too emotional, too demanding, too attached, or simply too much. Those explanations help them justify keeping their distance. But when you walk away calmly and begin rebuilding your life, something doesn't fit anymore. The person they considered too dependent was capable of leaving. The person they assumed would always return stopped returning. And suddenly, the version of you they created to make their behavior feel reasonable doesn't match reality. Then there is shame. Many avoidant patterns are connected to a deep fear of being exposed, rejected, or judged once someone sees the vulnerable parts underneath the surface. Sometimes distancing first feels safer than waiting to discover whether someone else might leave them. But when you leave with clarity instead of desperation, they can no longer hide behind the old story. There is no longer a partner chasing them to blame for the emotional pressure. There is simply them, their choices, and the consequences of those choices. And that can be incredibly uncomfortable. This is why your clarity can affect an avoidant more deeply than your pursuit ever did. Your love allowed them to remain protected behind familiar defenses. Your self-respect forces them to confront what those defenses may have cost them. And that doesn't guarantee they'll change or return. It simply means the dynamic has changed. You stop trying to convince them of your value. Now they're left to decide what your absence means to them. It simply remains there, unresolved and unprocessed. And for someone who has built their entire identity around independence, carrying that kind of shame can become overwhelming. Then the pursuit paradox begins working in the opposite direction. Avoidantly attached people can become more emotionally engaged when they sense a partner pulling away, while consistent closeness can activate their urge to retreat. That contradiction can make relationships incredibly confusing. When you were available, affectionate, and consistently present, your closeness may have activated their defenses. But once you stopped pursuing and redirected your attention toward your own life, the same attachment system they had been suppressing could begin drawing their attention back toward you. That doesn't automatically mean they have healed. It means the need for connection never disappeared simply because they learned to suppress it. Avoidant attachment can develop as a way of protecting oneself from disappointment, rejection, or emotional dependence. Over time, distance can start feeling safer than intimacy. But when the person they were distancing themselves from is genuinely gone, that distance may no longer feel like freedom. It can simply feel empty. Then idealization can begin. Once the immediate pressure of the relationship disappears, their memories of you may change. The qualities they once criticized can become the very qualities they miss. Your emotional openness, your willingness to communicate, your depth, your patience, and the familiarity you shared can suddenly become difficult to replace. New connections may feel different. Conversations may lack the history you had. Other people may not understand them in the same way. And because you're no longer present to challenge the fantasy with everyday disagreements and imperfections, the memory of what you shared can become increasingly polished. But this isn't necessarily proof that they've suddenly become ready for a healthy relationship. Sometimes it's simply the emotional consequence of realizing they couldn't fully appreciate something while they had access to it. Eventually, they may have to face the question they've spent years avoiding. Was protecting themselves from closeness actually worth losing meaningful connection? For a long time, they may have convinced themselves that needing someone was dangerous. They pushed vulnerable feelings aside and treated emotional independence as the ultimate form of safety. But when someone who genuinely loved them walks away with self-respect, those beliefs can become harder to maintain. And this is where attachment patterns become important. You cannot always solve a nervous system response with better explanations. When intimacy activates fear, the reaction can happen before conscious reasoning has a chance to take over. That's why simply telling someone to open up, communicate better, or stop running rarely creates lasting change. Real growth requires more than understanding the pattern. It requires doing something different when the old reaction appears. That change often begins when the consequences of avoidance become impossible to ignore. Not because someone was threatened or punished, but because reality finally showed them what their behavior was costing. And that's the part you need to remember. None of their realization belongs to you. You don't have to monitor their emotions, wait for their breakthrough, keep checking whether they've changed, or leave the door permanently open just in case they finally understand. Their realization is theirs. Their healing is theirs. Their accountability is theirs. And what they choose to do with that awareness is ultimately their responsibility. Your clarity was never foolishness. Your patience wasn't weakness. You loved someone because you saw something worth loving, and you stayed because you hoped the relationship could become healthier. But eventually, choosing yourself became necessary. You don't have to convince yourself that your needs are excessive simply because someone else isn't capable of meeting them. Wanting consistency, emotional openness, communication, and mutual effort isn't asking for too much. The deeper question isn't whether the avoidant will eventually miss you. It's this: what happens to your life when you stop waiting for someone else to choose you and finally choose yourself? That is where your real freedom begins. If they come back, remember that their realization is not your responsibility to carry. Their regret, their longing, and their healing belong to them. Your responsibility is to protect your clarity and stop confusing someone's potential with their willingness to change. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop waiting to be chosen and finally choose yourself.